Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Indelible Productions. I'm today's host, Ed Pullin. We have a great guest with us today, David Harrington. Dave, why don't you tell the audience who you are and what you do?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad we could make this work. It's an important topic for me, and I think it's an important topic for a lot of folks right now. I am an immigration attorney. I am in the Lehigh Valley, specifically in Allentown. I've been practicing for I guess about 10 years almost since I graduated law school. So I was there for the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration. So I've seen the ups and downs of this way and that way of the changing of in some instances just the interpretation of immigration law. It's all I do in my profession. I practice here down in Philadelphia. I go to New Jersey, occasionally up to New York, but I've seen the gambit of just about everything for immigration.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, it's so interesting that you have a perspective through time and the different administrations and also area. I think we do want to dig in a little bit to some of those. So you were around. I remember having discussions with you back in Trump 1.0.
Yes.
You you lived through that. We made it, but then you saw changes in Biden and now Trump 2.0. So why don't you talk a little bit about Trump 1.0, how things changed, and then where we are today.
Sure. Yeah. Certainly, I would say that with the time that I guess they had, and by they I mean those that are supporters of the Trump administration, they have been able to make things significantly worse, in my opinion, and in my clients' opinions, for immigrants that are going through the system. There were some inklings of this when they first came through, back in the 2017 through 2020. um, but some of the things that they have done now are completely beyond the pale of what we would have considered back then. Um, in a way, it accomplishes a lot of the same goals, but it's more polished. They've had more time to really dig in. But I think one of the more difficult things we've seen is they've also, in some of these appellate bodies, they've completely taken over. So they've gotten rid of anyone that was appointed by anyone other than the Trump administration. With maybe one or two exceptions here or there. It's a lot. It moves a lot faster as far as changes. The changes are a lot less. Um, I would say uh, cognizant of due process and things like that, and certainly are more draconian when it comes to how they treat infractions of immigration law. I guess if I could sum it up, it's worse than it was before.
Wow, yeah, some of what we had seen was so horrific. And we are going to get into some of that today. We've seen really horrible lawlessness as far as I'm concerned, and I want to ask you about that. Have you had clients who were illegally uh, detained? There were reports of U.S. citizens being deported. Have you seen anything like that?
So I have again, the way that this administration works is they will claim that whatever they're doing is lawful, right? So there was a case that came out called Matter of Hurtado. And by case, I don't mean from a court case. By case, I mean from the agency. I know we'll probably talk a bit more about it later, but the immigration court is not a court in the sense that it's separate and apart. It's its own independent judicial body. The immigration court is an extension of the Department of Justice under the Attorney General, which ultimately means that it's under the control of the executive branch or the president. And so they can, and this is something that I've heard from immigration judges themselves, regardless of if they personally believe it or not. The agency, which is the Department of Justice, EOIR, which is the Executive Office of Immigration Review, that's the court, has the ability to interpret its own regulations however it sees, right? So they are now construing certain portions of the Immigration and Nationalities Act, or the INA, which is the backbone of immigration, to read that anyone present in the United States without having been admitted or paroled into the United States, like on a tourist visa or as a a lawful permanent resident or something like that, is subjected to indefinite detention while their case is going forward. And to enforce this, what they've done is for folks who otherwise would not be subjected to detention, and even under Trump 1, these folks were not subjected to detention, are now being held in these massive detention facilities under this case, Matter of Hurtado, which came out last year. Um, the issue with that, and again, this is where it comes to, are they being held legally or not, right? The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security both say yes, they're being held legally under this authority of Matter of Hurtado, which is an agency determination. Majority, well, not a majority yet, but of those that have decided it, a majority of the circuit courts, almost 2 to 1, have said no. That is an illegal way to analyze the INA's provisions. You are violating the law. You're violating, their constitutional rights by detaining people like this, because they're detaining them without, a bond hearing. They're detaining them without, any chance of being released. And here in Pennsylvania, what we do, what most immigration attorneys do now, is you file what's called a habeas corpus petition to try to get people out from that, what we argue is an illegal detention. And the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, where Philadelphia, Allentown is located, the judges in that district have overwhelmingly agreed that it is illegal what they're doing. It is a violative of the law, and so we'll order an immediate release. But that doesn't prevent ICE from detaining people like that. So
Mm.
if you're asking, are folks being illegally detained? If it's up to a district court or a circuit court, in a lot of instances, yes, they're saying these are illegal detentions. But if it's the agency itself, they're saying no, right? So you have these folks that are getting picked up. You have these folks that are, basically whisked away, and they can be moved anywhere. They can be moved to the western part of Pennsylvania. They can be moved to New Jersey. They could be moved down to Louisiana, or out to Missouri or something like that. And it's hard sometimes to track because they can be moved, frequently. But there are courts that have said no, it's illegal what you are doing. So it's an interesting area. It's an emerging area of the law. We don't have anything in the Third Circuit yet, which is where Pennsylvania is, that has said whether or not definitively that is lawful or not. But we have, the Tenth Circuit, I think, the 11th Circuit, a couple other circuits, at least 4 circuits total, have said it is illegal what the government is doing for these detentions. So, in a sense, and I would argue, yes, there have been illegal detentions under this administration.
Wow, wow, wow. Oh, that sounds horrific. We saw these detainees that were shipped immediately out of the country to uh, basically a gulag, CCOT, a torture prison where they were assaulted and worse. And then we actually saw uh, Kilmar Abrego Garcia,
Mm.
a case like that where he was here legally, etc. But then the administration used their loss there to retaliate against him and basically make charges that they knew would not stick. And that was a case where he eventually was freed. But I the way I see it, the process is the harassment they want. They want to send a clear signal to the world that they don't want these people of color, etc., in this country. Have you encountered anything like this in your experience, and how do we prevent this from happening?
Yeah, so there have been a series of, and this is verifiable. This is out. There's been news reports on it of government actors and even attorneys representing the government that are not following orders of the court, or they are engaged in a conduct that typically is not up to par for an attorney. Um, Candidly, I have not really experienced malfeasance directly with attorneys for the DOJ. I have experienced where the attorney will allege, an incorrect fact in the record, and I have to correct that fact. We had someone that he had never had no criminal history in his entire life. He was picked up as a collateral arrest, which means that they were looking for somebody else, but they encountered him, and he didn't have documentation, so he was taken, and the person that they were looking for had some criminal history. Well, they alleged that it was his criminal history, and they were about to, deny him the opportunity to go in front of a judge to hear a bond case. And I had to correct the record and say, well, no, if you look here, there's no evidence that he ever had any of this, and the department needs to prove that. And then, the attorney said, well, give me a second, went off the record for a minute and came back and said, okay, judge, we're going to, withdraw that accusation. And it's like, okay, well, that's, how it should go down. So part of it is, and part of, especially with the, with Kilmar's case is, and I hate to do, again, for a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but to have attorneys that are dedicated to fighting back against these, improprieties of the government, um, to show, to go through the steps to preserve them. People working with, the ACLU, or working with some of these, nonprofits, and a lot of these nonprofits are really hurting right now because a lot of their funding is getting pulled. But just to provide a meaningful opportunity for someone to fight for their rights, and they make it difficult to fight for your rights in this administration. They make it punishing to fight for your rights. They and so just making sure that those resources are there is really important. One of the examples that I have about how they make it onerous to fight for your rights is, if an immigration judge renders a decision and an applicant for, say, asylum or what have you thinks that that decision was incorrect, right? If they believe the judge had an error, you can file for an appeal. The appeal filing fee used to be $110. Not nothing, but still relatively affordable for most folks. They increased it by almost a factor of 10. It is now $1,030 to file for that appeal. And yeah, and it is, and you have 30 days in which to file it. The administration had tried to make it so it was reduced down to only 10 days, but a court had enjoined that and said, no, 30 days. Let's keep it how it has been. So part of it is that there is a need for folks like the ACLU, folks that have nonprofits that are trying to help fight these injustices, to just help an individual that's going through it and try to set case precedent. Um, uh, the government is going to try everything to try to get somebody out, and similarly to that case. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, the client that I had said, I'm just gonna head out. But there was someone that had won their case, and then the government had continued to detain them after they had won their case, because they said, well, we're going to send you to another country. We're not going to send you to your home country. We know we can't send you there. We're going to send you to another country, which is what they were. It's similar to the Garcia case, right? In that they say, well, if we can't send you there legally, we'll send you somewhere else. Just get them out, get them out. And what they fail to realize is, well, maybe they do realize it, is to uproot someone, to send them somewhere they've never been to. A lot of these places do have some dangerous practices, and they have, gang and crime issues and things like that. Is that it's basically shipping our treaty obligations overseas, right? We're not going to hear your asylum case. We're not going to protect you here. Another country's going to do it, but it's not going to be here. So the way you prevent that is through, unfortunately, litigation. That, I mean, again, I'm an attorney, so I do the litigation, but and making sure that they are being held to their burden. And sometimes, and I've done this before, I did withdraw it after I spoke with the other attorney. Sometimes you have to ask for sanctions on the other attorney for the government. I had a government attorney that didn't respond, and the court kept saying you need to respond and giving him more and more time. And finally, after a couple months, I said, listen, this is the third court order that this honorable court has issued as to why he's holding my client. I would ask that you reissue the request, and I would ask that he be held in contempt of court. And immediately I got a response from the government attorney saying, whoa, wait, we'll work with you. We'll work with you now. So, it's unfortunate that that's what it takes to sort of hold folks accountable. But if it's someone's life, it's someone being held contrary to our Constitution, sometimes you have to play a bit of hardball like that.
Wow, wow. Yeah, there were reports that I think it was all confirmed too, that like there are some places they're being shipped that are in like civil war zones.
Yeah, well, certainly they're trying to expand it. There are these things called ACAs, an alternative country agreement, and whether it is due to economic pressure or political pressure, some countries are agreeing to accept folks from the United States. Um, One of which is a country called Uganda, and Uganda has its own issues,
Right.
especially track records with LGBT members, other minority groups in the country. And to simply say, well, because another country will accept this person, we're not obligated to hear their case, is, it's contradictory to the treaties and to the laws that were put in place to do so. And a lot of these ACAs really started taking off in the fall of last year,
Wow.
because of another agency decision. And what's worse about that agency decision, and I'm trying to remember, it was a matter of CIM S or CIMS, I think was the case, and probably someone, if there's an attorney nerd in the chat, they'll be like, no, that's not what it is. But anyway, it was a case that came out that essentially said, if the government proffers, if the government, by that I mean the Department of Homeland Security, proffers that an individual can be sent to another country, and that individual does not have a specific particularized fear of persecution in that country, that the immigration judge lacks jurisdiction to even hear that case or to overrule that motion.
Wow.
So at that point, they're a rubber stamp, and there are some older judges that have been around long enough to remember
Right.
when they actually could do a job, and they say on the record, they say, "Listen, I think you've made compelling legal arguments here. Unfortunately, the agency interpretation is that I don't have jurisdiction to decide this, so I am compelled to side with the Department of Homeland Security." So
Wow. Wow.
it just cuts due process in half. You know what I mean? It's no longer a
Wow.
neutral arbiter, the Department of Homeland Security and us. It's the Department of Homeland Security telling the neutral arbiter, you are compelled to follow what we have to say. So it is really difficult, and a lot of that, again, if you want to fight it, it has to go all the way up to these circuit courts. So that's really where it is, and it
Wow.
just takes
Wow.
a
Wow.
lot to rein it in.
Yeah, there's a now more than a decade into this, everybody's heard this quote, but I think it was a writer from the Atlantic, Adam Serwer, and the cruelty is the point. It sounds like.
I would agree with that statement. Yeah, they certainly, it's a deterrence, right? It's a reprisal in some instances, and I'll give you a good example of it. There was a case that came out called Matter of Q Lee. Matter of Q Lee dealt with indefinite detention again, and essentially what it had said was that if you were paroled into the United States, and the government could revoke your parole and place you into mandatory detention. Um, you would go back to the position in which you were when you entered the United States. The problem with that then became, and this is when it's almost like it's retaliatory to something, is that the Biden administration had created a parole program where individuals from certain countries, Nicaragua, Haiti, places like that, could come into the United States for 2 years, they had to pass background checks. They had to have sponsors in the United States, and they they had to go through the normal consular process to come in. They would come with this parole for 2 years, potentially be reunited with family they hadn't seen, get a job, get some economics going, and potentially, if they either had a business that wanted to petition them or a family member that wanted to petition them, get permanent status in the United States. Well, when Trump came in the second time, he revoked that program overnight. So people who had been here with documentation, with working papers, with a procedurally lawful entry, were all of a sudden, from one day to another, not only without status in the United States, but now if they're picked up by ICE, subjected to mandatory detention, where they're in jail until their case is resolved.
Wow.
And it was sort of, it was it was essentially a governmental bait and switch. But it was two different governments that the Biden administration had attempted to do something, and in retaliation of by this administration, because of the pettiness that you see, or whether or not it was just punishment for trying to do something good for immigrants, immediately it gets revoked, and it's revoked in such a way that you're now, on Tuesday, you had a job, you had work permit, you entered the United States with permission. On Wednesday, you're in a detention facility, and you're told you're never allowed out unless you win some narrow case. So it
Wow.
is,
Wow.
yeah,
It's upsetting even even hearing you relate these stories, Dave. This is it just can't imagine how horrific it is for these people.
yeah. It can. I mean, it's it's soul sucking, right? It's it takes hope away. They move goalposts, and there'll be a late filing, then they'll ask for an extension, and they'll do everything in their power to keep someone in there as long as they possibly can until the person breaks. I mean, we had, when it first started, there were a ton of people getting picked up, and I can't tell you the number of clients that said, I can't do this. If this is what it's going to be, just send me home. And to
Mm,
various misfortunes that they could face
wow.
back there.
Wow. Wow.
So it is, I, in my opinion, the legal framework of immigration right now has been misinterpreted by this administration to preclude as much due process as possible. They want to force people through. If they could force people through without anyone seeing it, they would do it.
Wow.
And it's
Wow.
it's it's just difficult.
Yeah, one thing that really frustrates me, the right wing propaganda machine. This is canon in that machine, and it's beat on daily that Biden had open borders. What are normal asylum laws allowing people fleeing violence, etc., to seek asylum in the United States. The law for 70 years or more. Um, they think that was open borders. He has people, a good portion of the country believing that. Can you explain, like in that Biden era? Yeah, there were a lot of encounters at the border, right? There were a lot of people who were seeking asylum. Uh, this is not the same as people coming here illegally.
Yeah. So one of the yeah. So first, I should say, especially as an immigration practitioner, um, as much as the right likes to say that Biden was this like open border guy, he wasn't. He had he created, his administration created what was called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways (BAR), which means if you entered the United States between May of 2023 and May of 2025, which is how they designated it, without going through one of their channels that they had set up, you were barred from getting asylum. So far from being an open
Hmm.
border, he had more border restrictions on the back end of it than his predecessors did. He said, "Do it the right way," and they created these great programs. They had CBP one, CBP is Customs and Border Protection. Um, where you signed up, you waited in Mexico, and you went on a designated day to present yourself to the Border Patrol. You said, "I'm here seeking asylum in the United States." They vetted you. They made sure that you hadn't had any previous hits in the system, and then they gave you a program on your phone called ISAP, which is not ICE app. It's ISAP. It's intensive supervision program. And they could follow you. You checked in with
Hmm.
immigration. You sent
Wow.
biometric information to them, and you had to do it the right way. Or when you went to try to get your asylum case done, you would be denied. So first, I think it's as a practitioner, we had our own gripes with the Biden administration, right? But they had a process. They had an order. It wasn't as all or nothing. They went in and they said, these are some sympathetic groups. Let's see if we can help them while still you know preventing folks that we don't know coming in. And so they had this system set up where you signed up for it, and you were known to them, and you presented an address at which they could find you if there were ever issues. And all of that got scrapped for this total lockdown and purge of the country of any folks that weren't born here,
Wow.
and
Wow.
some folks that that were. I actually, and this was, I don't know if this was just a mistake on their part. I actually represented a U.S. citizen once that was in deportation proceedings, um,
Wow.
and yeah, and it was thankfully it was started, I believe, under the first Trump. We got it under Biden to get it dealt with, but what had happened was they just didn't have the requisite paperwork. They didn't have a birth certificate. And so they were just placed in removal proceedings. They were placed in deportation proceedings, and we had to help them. And eventually we had a good outcome. We proved they were a U.S. citizen, and they were, granted a renewed certificate to show that they were a U.S. citizen. Um, but, when everything is a bureaucracy, you can have a bureaucracy with, hey, we got to correct this. Or you can have very strict enforcement on things that are very clearly, a danger. But if you have very strict enforcement on a vast bureaucracy, it tends to disfavor those that are trying to navigate their rights through the system.
Mm,
So,
mm,
the one thing that I thought was good about the Biden administration was um, they did try to set some of these. They had a lot of barriers that people ran into, and there were hiccups, and there were folks that you know probably even prior to Trump would have gotten a better outcome, but at least they identified sensitive areas. Um, but what they did was they said do it the right way, right? So they had a program that they tried to do. It was enjoined by it prior to them saying you couldn't enjoin anything nationwide. It was enjoined by a judge in Texas, wherein if you'd been in the United States for a certain amount of time, I think it was over 10 years, and you had a U.S. citizen spouse, and most people would think you can just get a green card then or your status, but you can't. So they created a parole program for those folks so that they could make right with the government. You pay a fee, you give all your paperwork in, you do a background check, and then you can try to get your status. Well, that was completely struck down, right? That the conservative court said you can't do that. That's some sort of violation here or there of
wow.
whatever, some right that they did. Um, so as far as this concept of Biden having an open border, and it's funny because sometimes I'll have clients that are going through it that might not necessarily be as aware of what they're saying, and they'll say, "Well, how come all these people get to come in? Biden just let millions of people in, but I got to do all this process." And it's like, no, they're going through the same process as you.
Wow.
And sometimes you have to remind them, like, well, listen, you're in a similar position to these folks. This is the same people, giving you a chance or not giving you a chance. So, um, it, it,
Wow.
it is an interesting, I think, misnomer. I mean, obviously, compared to the draconian measures that this administration is taking, sure, anybody would look open border, but it's not. It wasn't that way. It was an orderly approach to a humane immigration system, which apparently the nuance was lost by the person who claims that people are eating cats and dogs. Who would have thought, right? Who would have
Yeah.
thought that
Yeah.
nuance would be lost? But no, certainly I wouldn't describe it as anything close to an open border.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we saw at the time a vice presidential candidate. go on TV and a cable news station and tell people that sometimes you have to make up stories to get action. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Again, I am not a lawyer, but to me, law is about word. There are words written in these laws that describe a reality, a
Mm,
condition. And, nobody did this better than George Orwell in his writings. We do, and he predicted the world, I guess, from his experience. We see that authoritarian governments, they dissolve words, they change words, they slice words so that immigration law doesn't say immigration law, or um, birthright citizenship. uh,
right.
Four Supreme Court justices can say, well, the Constitution doesn't say what it says.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can comment on that
Oh,
because you have this experience with DOJ lawyers and judges that have to discern truth every day.
yeah. So certainly, and I want to preface this by saying that, um, with the exception of the Real ID Act in 2005, the basis of immigration law has really remained unchanged. The statutory provisions have remained unchanged. They're the same exact words since really like the 80s, right? So about 50 years. The only changes that we've ever seen in immigrant, again, there was the Real ID Act in 2005. Then there was IRA in 1996. IRA did introduce a lot of new things, but pretty much since 1996, it's the same statutory text. So it's all interpretation. It's all Orwellian in some instances.
Wow.
We're fighting a battle. Again, this goes to indefinite detention. We're fighting a battle of what does the word admitted mean? Does it if you, what they're arguing is admitted doesn't mean admitted. If someone lets you in a movie theater and you don't have a ticket, you're in the movie theater, right? You would say that you're admitted to that movie theater. The government says no. If you didn't buy your ticket, you're not admitted. You're seeking admission, even if you're in there, and it's just maddening. And the problem
Mm.
is, and I just had this recently. A lot of courts have said, "Come on, cut it out. Use the plain language of the word. What are you doing? We're not going to agree with this." And I've received, no lie, I just had one of these, a 48-page response from the government. 48 pages, over 10,000 words. By the way, a violation of the local rules on how long a brief is supposed to be
Yeah.
without asking for leave of court. And essentially just goes back and they start talking about cases from 1890, 1880, and what words are present participles and what words aren't, and what Congress meant versus what they meant here and there,
Wow.
even the same. So it is the entire thing is with this administration has been using words against what most people would consider to be their common meaning, right?
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
I mean, we just saw recently again with the birthright citizenship. You talk about jurisdiction thereof, right? So it's you know look at the historical context of it and jurist. And I'm very glad that we at least had five people that respected the or I guess it was six. I think it was they got one to join partially, but
Yes.
we have a majority. It's still scary that we didn't have a full 9-0 decision,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
of what does it mean to be under the jurisdiction of the United States? And I was planning, if it had gone the other way, and this is sort of tongue in cheek, but I was planning on filing motions to dismiss for every one of my clients that are in removal proceedings, because if the United States doesn't have jurisdiction, then how can they possibly have an immigration court, right?
Oh, that's
You know,
great.
are you
Yeah.
subjected to the laws of the country or aren't you? And really, when
Yeah.
it comes down to, and again, looking at the historical context of it, is you had certain individuals that weren't subjected to laws, like diplomats. Everyone's heard of the diplomatic immunity. Well, that's because you're not subjected to the laws of that country. So, in that regard, if you have a child in that country, that child is not a citizen of that country. It's a narrow exception. There were a lot of changes that went up to it, but there's also a lot of historical context. These are cases that were decided in the 1800s, where and there was a case regarding a Chinese national who had been born here, and the country said we're going to try to exclude you from the United States. China said we're not taking him. He's a citizen of yours. They said he's not a citizen of ours, and the court at that point decided, regardless of the where your parents are from, if you're born here, you're a citizen. Um, whether or not there's language related to, and they again, this is something that was done by statute, is whether or not Native American tribes are subjected to the jurisdiction of the United
Mm,
States when they're on tribal grounds, because again, they can break the laws of the United States, right? But in my opinion, if and I'm glad that I share this opinion with the majority of the Supreme Court, when it says the jurisdiction of the United States, it means can the United States punish you? Can the United States do something to you, right? And if they can deport you, they certainly have jurisdiction over you here in the United
mm.
States, and that is the plain meaning of it.
Wow.
I think the bigger issue, and I'm glad it was decided how it is, but I think the bigger issue is for how long we had a question of whether or not, based on again this Orwellian word, smithing, whether or not a president of the United States can, by proclamation, override a provision of the Constitution,
Mm,
right?
mm.
To completely go against, we can change the Constitution as the United States. It's a living document, right? We can have a constitutional convention. We can get Congress and the states to, we have amendments doing that. But if a president of the United States can unilaterally decide that they no longer agree with a set definition of a word, again, and to have three Supreme Court justices agree with that is unconscionable, right? Like, what do words mean,
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but again, lawyers do, we what is it? What did Clinton say? What's the definition? It depends on what your definition of is or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Lawyers are always out there arguing these, but I think to the extent that this administration has twisted so many of the words to mean what they want it to mean and not what perhaps it has meant or should mean or
Mm.
was intended to mean, it really pushes the boundaries of what is even arguable. And again, to have to
Yeah,
submit, I submit a 15-page brief saying why you're wrong, and you have to submit a 50-page brief with repetitive arguments going back to the 1800s, citing present, rules of
mm.
grammar and all that. Very clearly, you're trying to reach for something that really
Wow.
isn't there.
Wow. So suddenly you have to be not only a lawyer but a history major as well as a linguist in ancient language, right?
Yeah.
That's what they expect.
What did admitted mean in the
Yeah,
1770s?
yeah. Unbelievable. Wow, wow. So Dave, let me turn to maybe you can describe for the viewers kind of how this legal jurisdiction here is set up. So, like, what ICE office is kind of really active here? What locations are detainees taken to here?
Sure.
Across the county. You said you have some work outside and maybe across other states, but like just locally to Lehigh County here.
Yeah. So it depends on first of all, someone living in Lehigh County would still have to travel down to Philadelphia to do an ICE check-in. So ICE will for some folks, for a lot of folks, require that you physically appear in their office every 6 to 12 months just to make sure you're updating your address. Um, what we have seen is that at that instance, they will sometimes make an arrest. They are more likely to detain men than they are women just because of bed space issues. Um, but you do have a chance every time you go down there of getting detained by ICE there. If that's the case, then you're going to be temporarily housed at the Philadelphia Federal Corrections Facility, um, by ICE. And again, that's just because that's right across the street from ICE. If you're in, and at that point, if an attorney is fast enough, and there are actually some nonprofits that help with this, you can file a habeas corpus petition, challenge the lawfulness of your detention, and in some instances get out in a couple days, right? If you're picked up here in the Lehigh Valley, typically you're either going to be taken to a staging location, um, which can be any sort of local government that has an agreement with ICE, but then eventually you're going to end up at either Pike County or Moshannon Valley Detention Center. So
Wow.
Pike County it's in Pike County. It's up in the Poconos. That's the smaller of the two, and then Moshannon is out about 3.5 hours west of here, um, in the Western District of Pennsylvania, and it's in a more rural area, and that's where a majority of folks are housed. They then will also farm individuals out. So in the case of someone who, like I had said before, maybe they won their case, so the government is precluded from returning them to their home country, but they're not going to let them out. They're going to try to find them a different place to go. They can transfer them over to other jails, or not jails, federal corrections facilities. So, we have a couple in Chester County, or I have a couple folks in Chester County up at the, where is it? The Lewisburg detention facility. I've had some folks there. But that's more like overflow, for folks that are, either new into the system, or they're on cold storage, basically. They're waiting for federal litigation to work its way through. But if you're picked up here in the Lehigh Valley, typically you're going to end up in either Pike County, or you're going to end up in Moshannon. So the trick is, and if your family member is picked up by it, technically ICE maintains a database of who they have, right? You enter their A number. A number is it's an alien number, but it's basically a social security number for immigrants. Anyone that is here on a more permanent basis or is in the immigration court system is going to be assigned one. And so you can use that plus where they were, the country from which they were born, to find out where someone is. So that's technically how the system works. Practically, though, it can be days in some instances before that's updated. So you may have no idea where your loved one is. Usually, the ICE agents will tell you as you're being detained, we're going to take you up to Pike County, or we're going to take you out to Moshannon, or you're going to go here or there. And then when you get to that location, you can communicate with your family at that point. But, by that same token, if you're picked up and you're at Pike County, the next day they could take you somewhere else. I had a client who, we were waiting for a habeas corpus petition. It was the final day that the government could, answer before he was going to be set to be released. And they moved him from the middle of Pennsylvania to Louisiana, at like 6 p.m. the night of, right? It was supposed to be the last day. So then you have to reestablish the phone ties and potentially give money to the commissary if the phones aren't free, or reconnect if there's another way. There's some correctional facilities that you have to do like a webcam to connect with folks, or you have to go in person only in certain hours. So um, it is sometimes incredibly difficult to get a hold of someone as they're in transit. But if you were to be picked up here in the Lehigh Valley, likely Pike County or Moshannon Valley Detention Center is where you would end up.
Wow. 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 I had heard, and tell me what your take is on this. I had heard that tactics like that, where before a detainee can see a lawyer, sometimes they are already moved, maybe out of state even. Have you had that experience?
Well, I've had the experience of having clients moved quickly and to different locations. Um, as far as access to an attorney, um, if you're already in, well, it is sometimes difficult, right? I remember the one time, this is actually, it would be humorous if it wasn't so ridiculous. I was representing someone that was undocumented, that was going through a criminal, or not a criminal, a state court proceeding. We anticipated that ICE would be there to arrest this person. Out in front of the magistrate's office, there was a van, or no, not a van, SUV, that had four men wearing, Kevlar vests in the SUV. And I said, okay, that's got to be ICE. So I went up with my entry of appearance. All attorneys, they're immigration lawyers know you have to start with an entry of appearance. It's a G20. It's called a G28. It's just random numbers and letters. I mean, it signifies something, but to the average person, it's just random numbers and letters. Um, and I went up to the window and I said, "Excuse me, my name's David Harrington. You guys are ICE. I know you're here to pick up my guy. I'd like to submit my entry of appearance so that we can communicate once he's detained." And they said, "We're not ICE." They said, "We don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "Okay, all right. So what are you doing here?" And they're like, "All right, we're done talking to you." They roll out the window. So I go in. This was the idea of another attorney that was there at the time. I go in and I go to one of the sheriff's deputies and I say, "Hey, there's a car outside with four men wearing Kevlar vests, and they're saying they're not ICE. Do you want to go talk to them? Because otherwise, what are you doing here in your Kevlar vests?" And so he comes out and he goes, he knocks someone who goes, "Hey, I'm one of the sheriff's deputies. I think this attorney wants to submit some paperwork to you." And then they basically tell that guy to pound sand. They're like, "We're not ICE. We know what you're talking about. We're not taking that. Blah blah blah." And I'm like, "All right, that's fine. Whatever. We're gonna play this game." So I hold on to it. We go through. His state court attorney is doing his thing with the magistrate. I'm waiting out front to make sure there's someone who's very clearly ICE in the building too. And you can tell because they have the same rotating officers. So it's like, "Oh yeah, I've seen you at the station there." Sorry, not ICE at all, but no. So I talked to them, and then all of a sudden, it turns out they weren't there for my guy, thankfully. They're there for somebody else. So they all jump out of the car when that guy exits the building, like, "ICE, ICE, ICE." I'm like, "Oh, so you guys are ICE now. You weren't before. But now that someone's here without an immigration attorney, now
Wow.
you're ICE." So it can be difficult. There are systems that they had set up, especially under Biden. They had set up a lot of these channels for attorneys to communicate with ICE. There were inboxes that you could email. There were phones that you could call. There were points of contact. There were liaisons. All of it is gone now. I have sent several emails to the ICE inbox entering my appearance and have received nothing from them. So it's just a lot of it is basically a stonewalling of of communication between what I would think would in any other instance. I mean, if I was a criminal defense attorney, I'd be able to talk to the ADA about my client's case. I can't talk to the trial attorney about the case. Sometimes the trial attorney is reassigned 2 days prior. It's incredibly frustrating to try to get any sort of communication. And again, I'm not trying to skirt the system. I'm trying to I'm trying to work within the system, but apparently they aren't ICE until they have to jump out, and then they are.
So I know, you know, federal reps. Do you ever appeal to them? Like I know, we used to be represented by Susan Wild,
Mm-hmm.
who would be open to conversations like this and proposing ideas for litigation, etc. Do you ever interact with the congressional reps or ask them for anything related to support? We have Ryan McKenzie now, who
Yeah.
is, just whatever Donald Trump says, he spouts the same lines and the same falsehoods uh, about immigrants. And um, have you ever appealed to anyone, federal reps for assistance there, like Ryan McKenzie?
Yeah. So typically, member of Congress or a senator is someone that you excuse me that you reach out to. Sorry about that. So I had a couple folks that I had gone through Susan's office, when she was still in. What they're really good at doing is if something is stuck for some reason, they can help you unstick it. If there's an issue at they have channels to the Department of State and everything like that. If something is happening overseas, or if there's a compelling humanitarian need, they can sometimes step in. Um, it is I have had a client that was helped by Representative McKenzie. Um, Only one, so in the last couple of years, um, but that process can sometimes be arduous. I mean, typically especially for McKenzie, you know, maybe some sort of military service by the applicant would be required or something like that. When you reach out to these now, I mean. Congresswoman Wild's office had I think one or at least one dedicated, I think sometimes two staff that were handling these inquiries. I don't know if they have a dedicated person at Mackenzie's office or not, but usually what when we go to a representative like that, it's when the system has really broken down for an individual, not a systemic system breakdown like we see
Mhm.
now, but for an individual that says, well, I applied for this 2 years ago. I desperately need my wife here. My children are missing their mother. Um, on all the inquiries I say that it's outside of normal processing time. What do I do? And then at that point, if it's compelling enough, typically then you can go to a representative and ask that it be expedited. So it is it is worth it if you're in that position where they really can't help you. And I've had to tell people this before, is if the process is working well and you don't have any compelling need for an emergency, or if it's something that is like purely discretionary, right? Like your member of Congress typically can't reach out and tell the court to give you asylum in the United States. But if there is something that's outside of the process, or is something that's more egregious, then potentially that's when they can step in if there's some compelling humanitarian need. Again,
Okay.
I've had one person that was assisted by um, Congressman McKenzie. I had more than one. I had a few folks that were helped by um, Congresswoman Wild, but um, typically it's cases that are in a niche where they're stuck and there's some compelling humanitarian reasons.
Wow. Well, yeah. Thank you. I know we're getting close to time, so I'll get in two quick questions. So one, you hinted at this, like maybe at the start of the discussion. Uh, when you have these cases and the DOJ lawyers are making claims that maybe either lack candor or warp the law or the words. What Trump won't be in power forever, and eventually somebody that believes in the rule of law will return to power.
Yeah.
What do you see as accountability for these people? Or there, you mentioned sanctions early on. Are there cases where people would lose their law license, et cetera, disbarment?
Well, so attorneys operate, especially well in the realm of attorneys working against this, right? Like the Department of Homeland Security's attorneys and things like that. Um, anyone that is a licensed attorney owes what's called a duty of candor to the court. You can't lie to the court. You can't misrepresent to the court. If there is a misrepresentation, you need to retract it as soon as you understand that it's misrepresented, and and make a timely retraction and try to do better. Um, if you don't, there are mechanisms that are in place by state boards, by the bar associations of the given state, if you have acted in a way that is outside of your um, legal field, right? That's outside of the recommended comportment of your legal field. So I would think that if we wanted to restore faith in this system when a new administration comes in, the most there are a lot of attorneys that are out there that are frankly sort of rotating through the DOJ. You'll see a lot of folks who um, never had any immigration experience that are being hired because the benefits are great. Maybe their business wasn't doing so well. Maybe they're fresh out of law school. They just want some experience, whatever. And they're just trying to do their job. But there are other ones out there that are true believers in this. And there are some that have elevated themselves to a position of being an immigration judge, where some of their actions, I would think, when a new administration comes in, it might behoove the DOJ to make recommendations to state bar associations about discipline, right? And to pull them up and say, listen, you had your fun, but you're an attorney, and you need to comport yourself to an attorney. I've heard reports of an immigration judge, and I won't say any names. I don't want to get any loss, but I've heard reports of an immigration judge that because in a detained setting everything is online. It's like this, right? That muted the attorney representing the individual. That said, I'm not hearing what you have to say anymore, and muted the attorney.
Wow.
So it would be the same as a judge sending an attorney out of the courtroom and continuing the hearing without the respondent's legal advisor. So I would think instances like that where there's a pattern of sort of egregious behavior um, would need to be addressed. I also don't think it's out of the question, out of the picture. I wouldn't think it'd be unreasonable for a new administration to um, relieve of their duties some of these folks that have been in it. There are some judges that have, a 95, 98% denial rate on these cases. And I've put this to other lawyers before. I said, if you were a family law attorney and there was a judge that 98% of the time sided with mom, no matter what the other circumstances are, you would probably think that's an impartial judge, right? If you're a plaintiff's attorney and you have someone that's never going to return a judgment for a slip and fall, they're always going to decide for the person that owned the business. You would not consider that to be an impartial attorney, and there are an impartial judge, and there are judges that are like that in the immigration system. So, I would think that disciplinary complaints, relieving of duties, um, some of these folks. I mean, if you're outright committing contempt of court, filing false documents, I wouldn't put it outside of the DOJ to bring criminal charges against some of these
Mm.
folks because you're when the government can act outside of the constraints of law, right? When we're no longer a government of laws and due process and equal rights and equal access, then what are we? We've gone so far from the constitutional norms. If they
Mm.
can do that, and if there's nothing to check it back in, then you're going to lose. Then you default to law of the jungle, right? And you don't
Wow.
want that. So I would think that maybe not. I guess, again, not for everyone. And there's some attorneys I've been able to work with out there, um, but for some of these that have these really egregious patterns of behavior, I would think that a report to a state bar might be in order after all this is done.
Wow. 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 Well, great. Thank you, Dave. Last question, and thanks so much for your time here overall. You're
Yeah, of
a wealth
course.
of knowledge here. So, last question: have you had a case, in the last year or so, that really like stayed with you? That was the horror of this process, the destruction of this process were relevant and present, right there, and the cruelty, the pain.
Uh, I mean, I've had a few. I've had a few cases that have really, um, just the the way that they're handled. The disregard for the amount of human suffering that goes with it. Um, there is a portion of immigration law called cancellation of removal, which requires that an individual be in the United States for more than 10 years and have family members that are either young children or a spouse or an elderly parent that would face extreme and unusual hardship if they were to be removed from the United States. And I represented a guy, and I mean, I'm a father with two sons, right? Young kids, and he was the same. He was a father, a little younger than me, um, who had two young kids and just happened not to have status in the United States. He's been in the United States since he was a teenager, but because of a lot, and again, going back to some man made barriers, he was unable to regularize his status. We had the trial kept getting interrupted, but basically lasted about a month, where we'd have 2 or 3 hours of testimony. We'd be, they'd run out of time, 2 or 3 hours testimony, run out of time. And then finally we got back. And you heard about how, this guy took care of his kids, how his family was suffering because he was in detention because of, well, actually, no, we won the bond hearing on that. And the government appealed it. And then the appeal has just sat lingering since then, and eventually only because of new case law which interprets what the INA says under Trump, was denied his case and was ordered removed to a country that he hasn't seen since he was 18 years old, um, where his children have never been, where his children aren't going to be, you know, and so as a father to see another father ripped away from their kids, having built a life here in the United States, really because of this administration. I mean, this is another one of those collateral arrests. They weren't even looking for the guy, um, and just him being at the wrong place at the wrong time meant that now his kids grow up, at least for until they're 21, without a father in the country.
Wow.
Um, and just to see, and you'll get letters from kids who are 11 or 12 years old. They say, I miss my dad, I don't know where he is, I'd like to see him back. And it's just, I don't know, you choke up sometimes thinking about it. But it's just harrowing. I mean, I remember one time I walked in, we had a nice check-in. I walked in, the family was all there waiting outside. I walked in with the client, and in there, I said, "Listen, this is the end of it. We're going to take him, and there's nothing you can do, and you can file an appeal in the federal court if you want. We're going to take him." And I walk out alone, and the family's there waiting, and they look hopeful, and all of a sudden, like, they just drop. Their faces just drop because the door closes and he's not coming out with me, and it's just,
Wow. Wow.
and it's not like this guy was MS-13 or Tren Arago. He's just a guy. He's living his life. He's working hard and raising a family. It's just the indifference to the human suffering just because someone was born not in the United States is just, it's unconscionable. I mean, it's terrible. On a baseline human level. So yeah, there are a few that stick with me.
Wow. Wow. Well, Dave, I cannot imagine how busy you are, and uh, your clients, have a superhero for representation there.
I did my
We
best.
we cannot thank you enough for what you do. Just the humanity that you bring, and we really appreciate it. If you want to tell the viewers like how to get in touch with you and your firm.
Sure. Yeah. So our firm is on. It's right by Seventh and Chew in Allentown. It's 315 North Seventh Street. So we don't do walk-ins, but if you want to walk in and make an appointment for another time, we can do that. Our phone number is 484-274-6453. We have an answering service as well as someone at the front desk. Typical office hours, 9 to 5. Or if you want to email me, it's David, David, at ahilaw.com. A is in apple, H is in house, I is in igloo, and then law.com. We're also doing free consultations for the summer. So, if anyone does have questions, no risk on your end. We can set you up. We can do phone calls or something like that if you don't want to travel out in the heat. But certainly, we're here to assist however we can.
Wow. Well, Dave, thank you so much. We really appreciate the work you do, and then the humanity you bring to it.
Well, I appreciate you having me. I think it's important that more folks really know what's. I mean, everyone knows it's bad, but to really see the mechanics behind it, I think is really important. So I appreciate you guys having me on.
We're gonna bring you back.
There you go. All right, that sounds good. I have more to say.
Great. Okay. Thank you so
All
much,
right,
Dave.
absolutely. Yep. Thank you so much for having me.